Hi everybody, this is topic 5 and it is on the lymphatic system and immunity. Now, your lymphatic system and immunity are the body's defense mechanisms against threats that arise from both inside the body and of course from the external environment as well. We're going to start with the lymphatic system, and in terms of detailed learning objectives, they're to be able to describe the functions of the lymphatic system, describe the structure and function of components of the lymphatic system, be able to describe briefly the structure of lymphatic vessels and explain how lymph, which is a really hard word to say sometimes, is transported, list 5 mechanisms by which lymphatic return is achieved, and finally name the major types of lymphatic cells and state their function. So not too many learning objectives for this part, so let's get started. So just a little bit of an introduction to begin with. The lymphatic system is the body's kind of drainage network. It consists of a series of vessels, nodes, and organs. The lymphatic vessels are quite similar to veins that we've studied before, and they do transport this fluid called lymph. And this lymph is a clear fluid which is rich in leukocytes or white blood cells, particularly lymphocytes. The lymphatic system has a series of lymph nodes, and these are small bean-shaped structures that are scattered throughout the body, right? And they act as these kind of filtration points where potentially harmful substances like bacteria and toxins are trapped and neutralized and destroyed. We also have, though, organs of the lymphatic system, such as the spleen and the thymus. They play vital roles in filtering blood and also the site of, where lymphocytes mature. And this ensures that the body is really well, set up to fight infections. And together, the lymphatic system and immune systems, which we'll learn about soon in part 2 and part 3, work to fight infections and diseases. So this slide here is just giving us an overview of the components of the lymphatic system. Important to note, everybody, that when you're looking at a figure of the lymphatic system in a textbook, it's always denoted in green. So if you think, if you think about looking at this here, at this pattern of lymphatic vessels and nodes and all of that, they sort of follow the arteries and veins of the circulatory system. So if you think of the arteries and veins like, your highways or freeways going through the body, the lymphatic system is a little bit like the side roads that kind of, course along the same sort of path. Okay, so components of the lymphatic system, we have the fluid, which is the lymph, right? Whenever you're thinking of the lymphatic system, you need to be thinking of your T lymphocytes and your B lymphocytes, okay? These are formed in your red bone marrow, then they leave the red bone marrow. The T lymphocytes, of course, mature in the thymus, and then, the T and B lymphocytes migrate then to lymphatic tissue that's found in lymph nodes and also in organs of the lymphatic system. So we do have this series of lymphatic vessels that carries the lymph. Some of these are really small and we call them lymphatic capillaries, and then they get larger into these lymphatic vessels that we'll talk about in a minute. Lymphatic tissue then is rich in T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, but also dendritic cells, macrophages, and other immune cells as well. We have lymphatic nodules, so your tonsils are lymphatic nodules. We also have these little crazy little bean-shaped little lymph nodes that filter the lymph, and they're sort of found dotted along the length of these lymphatic vessels. We'll talk more about them soon. I like to call them like the nightclub of the lymphatic system, because this is where all the action is. So you've got all of your, your T and B lymphocytes and macrophages, and they're kind of recognizing different sort of antigens or pathogens, right? And hooking up with them and neutralizing them and destroying them. Okay, we also, as I mentioned, we have tonsils, and we also have the spleen, which is a lymphatic organ, as well as the thymus. And remember, the thymus is the site where T cells mature, but also, has glandular function because it secretes that hormone thymosin, which, drives T cell maturation. We'll talk briefly now about the functions of the lymphatic system, and there are 3. So starting with the first one, which is the most obvious, right? So defense or immunity. Microorganisms such as bacteria, viruses, other microorganisms, and any kind of other foreign substances as well are filtered from lymph that enters lymph nodes, and also from the blood by the spleen. Here you can see a diagram of a lymph node, and lymph kind of flows into that lymph node, which is then stacked with all of these immune cells such as B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, macrophages, and those plasma cells that are derived from B cells, and they're churning out antibodies. So all of these immune cells in the lymph nodes are always standing ready to recognize and respond to foreign antigens or cells or chemicals. The second function then is fluid recovery, and the lymphatic system plays a really important role in maintaining fluid balance. Now cast your mind back to when we looked at capillary exchange in the blood vessel topic. And this is what we're talking about here. Remember that fluid leaves the capillary at the arterial end, and most of that fluid is returned at the venous end of that capillary bed. But remember, we spoke about some of that fluid, that excess fluid, being picked up by lymphatic vessels. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. So 20 litres of plasma is released into the interstitial space, which is all of those spaces between tissue cells. So 20 litres per day due to that capillary filtration. Remember, we talked about that net filtration pressure. Now, this fluid is known as interstitial fluid or tissue fluid. 17 litres of that 20 litres is reabsorbed directly by blood vessels, but the lymphatic system then drains the remaining 3 litres of excess fluid and eventually, drains it back into the bloodstream via lymphatic vessels, trunks, and, larger trunks and ducts as well. So, if your lymphatic system for some reason is not working properly, then that leads to things such as tissue edema or tissue swelling. The third function then is fat absorption. Okay, now we're talking about, the lining of the digestive tract here in the small intestines, without going into it in too much detail. But in the inner layer, we have these finger-like extensions of the mucosa called villi or singular villus. Now, for the purpose of here, we can say that there are capillaries that extend into the villus, but also in green here, we have these little vessels called lacteals. And lacteals belong to the lymphatic system, and they are lymphatic capillaries. And it's through these lacteals then that we have the absorption of fat and other substances from the digestive tract. And that fluid then is called chyle. The other sort of end products of digestion of carbohydrates and proteins enter those capillaries, those blood capillaries directly, but the fat has to go through the lacteals. And eventually those, lymphatic capillaries will drain into larger vessels and eventually into the venous system. And so lymph then is this clear, watery, colourless fluid, which is quite similar to plasma but doesn't contain as much protein. It is formed, as I've mentioned, from the fluid that is leaked out of the capillaries. And it does contain ions and nutrients, gases, some protein, hormones, enzymes, and waste products. And eventually that lymph will return to the circulatory system via veins. And it, of course, as I mentioned, it is essential for fluid balance. So the lymphatic capillaries, as it says here, are the smallest of the lymphatic vessels. Now, they are more permeable than blood capillaries, and that's because of their structure, right? If we look over here, if we expand here, we've got a capillary bed, we've got our little lymphatic capillaries there, and if we expand on it here, you can see these endothelial cells here that form these flaps, and so they kind of overlap, but they're also kind of loosely connected to each other. And this allows them to be way more permeable than blood capillaries, right? And so nothing in the interstitial fluid is excluded from entering the lymphatic capillary. So the lymphatic capillary is going to allow bacteria and other cells to enter. These endothelial cells as well, this overlapping kind of nature, creates these one-way valve-like flaps that open when interstitial fluid pressure is high and close then when it is low, and that prevents then fluid from going back into the interstitial spaces. Now, these little lymphatic capillaries are found in most tissues in the body, except the central nervous system, the bone marrow, and then these avascular tissues, so those tissues without blood vessels, so cartilage, the cornea in the eye, and the epidermis of the skin. Now, the lymphatic capillaries join to form sort of larger lymphatic vessels. And these are kind of, fairly similar to small veins. They are larger than capillaries, and they're composed of those three layers that we learned about when we were talking about arteries and veins. So they have the tunica interna, which consists of endothelium and also valves. And those one-way valves are, in small lymphatic vessels, are similar to those ones in veins. We also have a middle tunica media containing elastic fibers and smooth muscle, and then the outer tunica externa, which is that thin outer layer. And the vessel wall has a similar structure to blood vessels in general, but only thinner. So if we look at the route of the flow of lymph, starting from those little tiny lymphatic capillaries, which join then to form lymphatic vessels, and they, gradually become bigger. And we've just summarized it here as collecting vessels. And that lymph goes through many lymph nodes, and the vessels all sort of travel alongside blood vessels. Eventually, two lymphatic trunks will collect all of that lymph. And these two lymphatic trunks are the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. And they will drain then into veins just before the systemic blood returns to the right side of the heart. So you can see in this lovely pale purpley lilac-y color here, the parts of the body that are being drained by the right lymphatic duct. So lymph from the right arm and the right side of the head and the thorax, and that will then empty into the right subclavian vein. Now you can also see that the thoracic duct, which is much larger and longer than the right lymphatic duct, is collecting lymph from a much larger areas of the body. So receiving lymph from below the diaphragm, and then all these left sides of the arm and the head and the neck and the thorax, and it then empties into the left subclavian vein. Okay, we're going to briefly look at these lymphatic pumps that help to move lymph along in lymphatic vessels, and look generally at how lymphatic return is achieved. Because lymph does flow more slowly, and it flows at lower pressures than venous blood. So it kind of needs some help, right, to be moved through lymphatic vessels. This is done in a variety of ways. Firstly, we have skeletal muscle contractions. The skeletal muscle there contracting will compress the lymphatic vessel, and that will help to move lymph along. At the same time, we have the presence of these one-way valves that prevent backflow. And when skeletal muscle contracts, it's going to compress that lymphatic vessel, and the valve inside the vessel, the two flaps, are going to meet in the middle and close, and that prevents that backflow of blood. And then when the muscles relax, it's going to allow that part of the lymphatic vessel kind of to expand and fill up with lymph, and then the next contraction of skeletal muscle will push it along. Now, we also have some lymphatic vessels that rhythmically contract themselves, and that pushes lymph along. So they have smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle contracting will move the lymph, and stretching of vessels, those lymphatic vessels, will stimulate that contraction. Now, we also have the presence of the thoracic pump, which aids flow of lymph from the abdomen to the thoracic cavity. Okay, and this is facilitated by the pressure changes that occur when we breathe in and out. So during inspiration, or when we breathe in, the pressure in the thoracic cavity is going to decrease, and that allows the lymphatic vessels kind of to expand, and lymph flows into them. Then when we breathe out, the pressure in the thoracic cavity increases, and that increase in pressure is going to compress those lymphatic vessels, and again that compression is going to move that lymph along. We also have rapidly flowing blood in the subclavian veins will draw lymph into it, and exercise, of course, will significantly increase lymphatic return. We'll talk briefly about these lymphatic cells here, but we will go into them in a bit more detail when we get to the innate and the adaptive immune responses. We have three types of lymphocytes. We have natural killer cells that are abbreviated to NK cells, and they are a lymphocyte of the innate immune response. These are always, performing immune surveillance, so they're always on the watch for anything that's perceived as foreign, and they destroy virally infected cells and also cancerous cells. So they're the NK cells. Then we have the T lymphocytes, or otherwise known as the T cells, that are important in the adaptive immune response. And they function to recognize and attack foreign antigens. Remember, they formed in the red bone marrow, they mature in the thymus, and they secrete chemical messengers. Now, without going into too much detail here, because we'll talk about it later, here we have a T cell that has become activated by an antigen that's been presented on the surface of this infected cell. That leads to the release of these perforins, right? And these perforins then will destroy that virally infected cell. Now we also have B lymphocytes, otherwise known as B cells. And you can see a B cell here with these kind of, the B cell receptors there are like antibodies, or they are antibodies on the surface of the B cell, and they're getting activated by an antigen as well. And so when they get activated, they proliferate. So they divide and they differentiate into these little plasma cells, which are like antibody factories, because they are churning out these antibodies that are specific. This is very cool. They are specific to the antigen that stimulated the B cell to divide in the beginning, right? And these antibodies will either directly neutralize those antigens, or they'll do other things, and we'll talk about that later, and kind of mark them for destruction. We also have antigen-presenting cells, and again, more about this later. They help T cells to recognize foreign antigens, and there are three types of antigen-presenting cells. We have the macrophages, so those large tissue macrophages that are phagocytic, and they are derived from the white blood cell being the monocyte, right? Between you and me, the macrophage is my favorite cell. I just adore them. They just work so hard, cleaning up debris everywhere. Dendritic cells as well. These are found in the epidermis, mucous membranes, lining respiratory tracts and digestive tracts and other tracts as well. And they're also found in lymphatic organs. And we also have these reticular cells, and these are kind of branched, stationary, antigen-presenting cells that also contribute to the structure or the stroma of lymph.